Hello and welcome to the first episode of The Man Behind the Curtain, a new close reading series for 2026 from the London Review of Books. I'm Thomas Jones, a senior editor at the paper and the main presenter of the LRB podcast. For this series, I'm delighted to be joined by the writer, artist, twice Booker shortlisted novelist and contributor to the LRB since 2007, Tom McCarthy. Hello, Tom.
Hello, nice to be here.
I am sorry we're both called Tom. Shouldn't be too confusing, I hope. This first episode is about Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes. But before we turn to the ingenious gentleman of La Mancha, the Knight of the Sad Countenance, Tom, why the man behind the curtain?
Well, I was thinking of the scene in The Wizard of Oz where Dorothy and her friends finally get to meet the wizard, and as he looms spectral and booming in front of them, the curtain at the side starts coming open and to reveal the little man cranking the levers and speaking into the voice distorter to produce the illusion of a wizard. And even as he's rumbled, in a panicked voice, says into the microphone, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. It struck me that in some way, that I'm not quite certain exactly how, but in some way this seems perhaps to allegorize the way we might understand the novel as a form.
But the man behind the curtain isn't simply another name for the novelist, is it?
No, of course, we always know there's an author somewhere, but I think the scene could be seen to allegorize our understanding of the novel in the following way. I mean, a naive understanding of the novel would maybe hold that all this novelist does is reveal some essence that's present in and of itself, right? Some psychological or spiritual or universal truth, and that the work sheds light on a trove of identity or experience or communicates an intensity of feeling that was there already and exists independently of the work which is merely reflecting or expressing it. And by contrast, I would suspect that what we might call the novelistic mode or zone or state or condition, that this condition only begins really when the mechanisms through which these fantasies of authenticity are projected themselves become, to a large extent, the subject under scrutiny. So when the various scaffolding and armatures of, law, cultural codes, often in conflict with each other, the economic frameworks and substrates, the technological frameworks and substrates, and not least the various systems of representation, the manifold artifices through which both the world and the novel are conducted, including other books. When all these start to poke through the surface, to become the agon, the central conflict of the work, rather than just be, camouflaged in the background, disguised as something natural. Or the very least we could say, as in that scene in The Wizard of Oz, is that perhaps the novel is the space in which these two perspectives, the wizard-focused one on the one hand and the kind of larger view, man behind curtain and wizard vision on the other, in which these two perspectives kind of enter into tension with each other. And this tension itself is what both generates the fantasy of authentic being and subverts or unravels it. And that's why I invoke that scene, right? Not as some kind of formula or dogma, but as a kind of primal scene, to use the language of psychoanalysis. I want it to be the background to all our discussions. So rather than the humanistic, or to give it a more contemporary spin, neoliberal metric of sovereign individual experience, we're going to focus on the 5 M's: money, matter, machinery, mediation, and metaphor as they join battle against the big other M, metaphysics.
And that tension that you've just described, or that dynamic between the construction of the appearance of naturalness in fiction and the simultaneous questioning or undermining or unravelling, as you put it, of the illusion, is clearly a driving force in Don Quixote. So for those who don't know or who don't remember, Don Quixote was published in 2 volumes, the first volume in 1605 and the second in 1614. And by that point, Cervantes was already, well, not that old, but he was born in 1547, the son of a doctor. He went to Italy to work, I guess, as a soldier. He fought at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. He was later taken prisoner by pirates. Eventually where he tried to escape, didn't manage to escape. He was eventually ransomed and returned to Spain, where he tried to make a living as a writer. He wrote plays. He wrote a pastoral novel called La Galatea, which didn't really get anywhere. And then in 1604, not quite out of nowhere, but this amazing book, the first part of Don Quixote, was published. So what is the setup of the book?
It's very simple. Some guy who's maybe called Quixada or Quezada or maybe Quexana. This guy reads loads of books of chivalry. So he reads, Amadis of Gaul, Felix Marti of Hyrcania, Tyrone le Blanc, Bellianus of Greece, and so on and so on. And he reads so many of them so intensely that these books kind of take over his imagination, as Cervantes writes, and this is John Rutherford's 2000 translation. Cervantes writes, everything he read in his books took possession of his imagination. Enchantments, fights, battles, challenges, wounds, sweet nothings, love affairs, storms, and impossible absurdities. The idea that this whole fabric of famous fabrications was real so established itself in his mind that no history in the world was truer for him.
And so, having done this, he then becomes convinced that he is himself a character from one of...
Yeah, well, he goes through two phases. The first phase, the first short-lived phase, he thinks, well, I'll just be a writer and kind of write more adventures because, these texts are really quite open. They're kind of open source, you can just carry on writing more. But he gives up that idea pretty quickly. He says that's not enough to be a writer. You've got to be a doer. So he dons a rusty suit, puts some cardboard in for the visor, renames his clapped-out horse Rocinante, renames a local very homely wench, Aldonza Lorenza. He renames her Dulcinea, and he sets out on these sallies, on these adventures with predictably farcical results. He's endlessly falling off his horse, getting beaten up, misinterpreting every possible situation through this filter of chivalric fiction and generally causing mayhem.
And so what is Cervantes doing with this?
I think he's doing two things. I think he's using this premise to firstly elaborate a theory of aesthetics. So over the course of the 900 plus pages, in which he pretty much does the same thing on repeat, Quixote, over these pages, issues are raised and debated of imitatio, verisimilitude, literary genre, poetic or narrative forms, and so on. And the second thing I think he's doing is to elaborate, and I mean this in a very modern sense, to elaborate a theory of media.
So that's one of your M's, the mediation.
Yes.
And so what is this theory of media?
I think the best way of describing it to a contemporary audience is by reference to the wonderful 2006 film by Douglas Gordon and Philippe Perreno, just simply called Zidane, a 21st century portrait, which is a multi-camera study of the epocally brilliant footballer Zinedine Zidane over the 90 minutes of a single La Liga, Spanish La Liga game.
Yeah, it's a very, very brilliant documentary written about in the London Review of Books by Paul Myerscough.
Interestingly, they cut away at half-time to show what else is going on in the world during those 90 minutes. And one of the events they mention is a marathon 24-hour reading of Don Quixote. At the outset, we get Zidane's text over to the image of Zidane playing football, and he says a beautiful thing. Zidane says, he says, as a child, I had a running commentary in my head when I was playing. It wasn't really my own voice. It was the voice of Pierre Cangioni, a television anchor from the 1970s. Every time I heard his voice, I would run towards the TV as close as I could get for as long as I could. It wasn't that his words were so important, but the tone, the accent, the atmosphere was everything. I think Don Quixote is as seduced by early modern media, the early modern media of, chivalric books, as Zidane was as a child by the late modern media of of television. I mean, this is Sedan's ambition. It's not to be a great football player. It's to be in that media space. And even when he becomes a great football player, he says, now I'm in that space. I'm like the editor. I can drop the sound up. I can focus on the grass. I can look at the screens. The massive difference, so the seduction is the same. The difference is that whereas Sedan can, from childhood onwards, train and become really good and realize his fantasy of being the one in that media space, Quixote can't, because A, it's fictional, it's not real, and B, it's defunct already. I mean, chivalric fiction is over 100 years old when this novel is set. The picaresque is over 50 years old. In 1555, a petition was presented to the Spanish Parliament at Valladolid, urging them to ban chivalric books. Like the Christian parents of America wanting to ban heavy metal albums because of the deleterious effect it was having on the youth. So this is 50 years before Don Quixote is written. It's already old hat. And Quixote is old. He's 50 when he becomes seduced by all these. So there's this general anachronistic setup, a whole disjuncture or décalage, an out of jointness of different periods going on, which is fascinating.
Yeah, he's belated. That's part of his...
He's belated, but it works in both directions. So, for example, when he sets out on his first sally as a knight errant, he kind of plays himself a soundtrack in his head of how it's going to be written in the future. He says to himself, "Who can doubt but that in future times, when the true history of my famous deeds sees the light, that the sage who chronicles them will, when he recounts this my first sally so early in the morning, write in this manner, quote, scarce had ruddy Apollo spread over the face of the wide and spacious earth the golden tresses of his beauteous hair, and scarce had the speckled little birds with their harmonious tongues hailed in musical and mellifluous melody the approach of Rose Aurora, who rising from her jealous husband's soft couch disclosed herself to mortals in the portals and balconies of La Mancha's horizon, when the famous knight Don Quixote de la Mancha, quitting the slothful feathers of his bed, mounted his famous steed Rocinante and began to ride over the ancient and far-famed plain of Monitel, end quote, question mark. So, in order to experience the presence of his present, he has to root it through a putative future mediation that itself is rooted via 100-year-old anachronistic dead media form. It's a quite extraordinary situation he's in here.
And part of the comedy of that is the way in which he is so mistaken, that he wants to believe, or he does believe, or in some sense he is a knight-errant from an old book of chivalry, but at the same time he's this sort of 50-year-old modern Spanish guy in 1600 with not a lot to do. Much of the comedy of the book or the tragedy of the book, depending on how you look at it, is from the collision between the world he believes he inhabits, the imaginary world of fiction that he's inhabiting, and the real world that this is continually running up against. And everyone who meets thinks he's mad. I mean, that could be another of your M's, is madness, but it's not that. And his idea, he's been driven mad by the books. But in some sense, is it the books that have driven him mad, or is it the conflict between the books and the, in quotes, real world? Because just that other thing about him he imagines he's a character in a book, but he is a character in a book. So in that sense, he is right. He's the only one who sees the truth that he is a character in a book. Everyone else thinks they're real, and they couldn't. They're all mistaken because they're only characters.
Yes, I mean, there's an endless series of what we might call feedback loops. I mean, everything he does is mediated not just by the meta frame of knight errantry, but every little kind of micro episode is set up in a feedback loop with the kind of mini reference. It's very like in Proust, so he can't even relate to Albertine without quoting Racine, and so to explain what's happened to him when he's been beaten up by merchants from Toledo, Don Quixote recites the lines about the killing of Baldwin by Charlemagne's son Carloto from a popular ballad, or even in real time, as these prostitutes are undressing him in an inn, he overwrites them as ladies of the castle by intoning and slightly adapting this ballad about Lancelot. So, but yeah, as you say, I mean, the books are the problem. So when he's laid up and delirious after his first sally, and the curate and the barber and his niece are attending to him, the way they kind of get a reading on what's wrong with him is not by taking a blood sample or whatever, but it's by going to his library. This is the source code of the problem. I mean, and they say we've got to get rid of all these books. But then, of course, a very interesting reversal takes place as they're taking the books off the shelf to take away and burn. They start saying, "Oh no, we can't burn this one. This is wonderful." They say, "This is wonderful." So they say, "Oh no, not this. The Mirror of Chivalry contains some of the creations of the famous Matteo Boiardo, from which the Christian poet Ludovico Ariosto also wove his tapestry, and Palmerin of England should be kept and preserved as something unique, and a casket be made for it like the one Alexander the Great found among the spoils of Darius and designated as a case for the works of the poet Homer," and so on and so on. So they're entering, again, this same kind of space. Their role as destroyers turns into one as curators. But yeah, the books are the problem. There's a contagious force of this kind of madness.
And it isn't only Don Quixote who's affected by it, although in some sense he seems more aware of the infection, as it were. I mean, there's a bit which when I first read this as a teenager and being really taken by that. There's that moment when there's the shepherd called Chrysostom, and he's in love with it's a classic pastoral lyric situation. You have the lovelorn shepherd and the cruel, so-called cruel maiden who's in love with, and she cruelly rejects him. And he eventually dies, allegedly from her cruelty. And then his friends are all sort of very angry with her. And then she comes to them and she gives this sort of amazing speech where, one thing she says, "I do not understand why," this is J.M. Cohen's translation, "merely because she inspires love, a woman who is loved for her beauty is obliged to love the man who loves her." And she gives this very reasonable, she never gave him any reason to do it once. And essentially he's a stalker who drove himself to death, and that's really not her problem. And all his friends are, they marvel. Everyone's amazed at her good sense as well as her beauty. But then at the end they bury him and they put up his tombstone, which says that he was, where there's a poem saying that he was killed by her cruelty, because they can't escape the literary fantasy that he was living when he died. And she comes and she sort of tries to break it. And they all say, "Oh yeah, no, they're quite right." And then they immediately go back into this literary fantasy. So it's not only Don Quixote. Actually, everyone in this book is sort of caught up in
the contagious force of this fantasy takes over almost everybody. I mean, there's even a scene later on where Altisidora, this woman who's been playing the role of, tricking Don Quixote by playing the role of someone who's meant to be in love with him. When he rejects her because he's loyal to Dulcinea, she gets genuinely angry. I mean, she gets furious, says, "How dare you reject me?" So we'll talk about this later, but by the end, Don Quixote seems to be the only sane one. I mean, everyone else is completely taken by this fantasy, yeah.
Yeah, but if we're back in his library quite near the beginning, and he is convinced that the destruction can't have been done by his friends. So he thinks
while they're debating which ones to keep and which ones to burn, the housekeeper does just go in and burn the lot. But this just fuels his fantasy, because he says, "Aha, Freston the enchanter from Don Belianos of Greece, this dragon has burnt it, and this is why there's all the smoke there." So it just makes him more and more entranced. I mean, yeah, and apropos of that word, entranced. I mean, to come back to the question of media, I think all of this anticipates 20th century media theory. I mean, but at two moments in particular. One would be Marshall McLuhan's famous claim in his 1964 book, Understanding Media, where he says, look, the true content of each medium is the previous medium. So the content of photography is painting, the content of cinema is theatre, and so on and so on. So this we can see this very clearly in Don Quixote. The content of the first great example of a kind of sophisticated, emergent, modern novel is the earlier naive genre of knight errantry. I mean, that's kind of pretty straightforward. But there's another kind of a less well known, but for me equally important media theorist from the late 90s called Arjen Mulder, who writes a wonderful piece called Transmedia in 1999. And his formula for media is as follows. He writes that media considered as an autonomous sphere are not out to inform. What they create in their users is not informedness, knowledge or insight, but transport, ecstasy, hot or cool, hypnosis, trance. And I think trance is a very good way of understanding not just Don Quixote's condition. I mean, he is entranced, but the general contagious condition that takes over the whole novel, the whole world of the novel.
And including his squire, Sancho Panza. It's interesting to me that one of the ways that it often gets talked about is the idea that, you know, Don Quixote is they're physically very different. Don Quixote is very tall and thin, and Sancho Panza is short and fat, and that Don Quixote sort of represents a terrible word, but he sort of lives in a world of the imagination and of fantasy and of the mind, and that Sancho Panza is this sort of incredibly earthy, you know, he's about appetite, and
Auden calls him pure matter.
and he's and he's very focused on shitting, and when he needs to shit. And there's the bit where he says, when Don Quixote has been captured and has been taken back to his village towards the end of the first volume, and Sancho Panza's saying, well, you know, maybe you've been enchanted, and the way we can tell is, you know, do you need a shit? But, yeah, because if you're enchanted, then you wouldn't need to. And then Don Quixote says, well, actually, no, now you mention it, I kind of do. And he says, well, you can't be enchanted then. So yes. Tell them you need a crap or we can run away. But at the same time, Sancho Panza is completely wrapped up in Don Quixote's trance. Because he does seem to believe that he is a knight errant and he's the squire and he will be rewarded for his service. So is he entranced as well?
Well, he straddles the line. He can see that, at times he can see that Quixote is deluded. At other times he is himself entranced and believes that what seems to be, or he sees the world through the filter of Quixote's delusion. And then he has this much more kind of base material motivation through the book. He's been promised an island to govern, and he wants money. And so there's a wonderful passage towards the end where he just, for about half a page, tots up everything he's owed from the last couple of years. He's got it all in his head. But yeah, no, there is a very interesting interplay. So at one point, there's been a whole charade put on for them where Merlin has said, and his entourage, who are people dressed up, have said, well, Dulcinea, who has been enchanted, can be unenchanted if Sancho Panza receives however many thousand whips, 3,000 lashes on his bare buttocks. And Panza goes, I don't see what my bum has to do with enchantment. So it's a very, this is very anti-metaphysics, you know, in a sense. He can see if not the mechanism, at least a kind of physicality, a materialism, and a monetary kind of materialism behind this whole scene of operations.
But both of them, that Sancho Panza and Don Quixote, can both... It's not as if Don Quixote can't see what's happening in the real world around him and the real things. But one of his explanations for that, right, is that they've been enchanted. There's a bit where he goes to attack. He thinks of these two great armies and he goes in to take the side of one of them. And in fact, it's a flock of sheep, and he starts killing all these sheep, which the shepherds are unsurprisingly quite angry about, and then they beat him. But he says, an enchanter turned them into sheep. So he can see the real world, but he seems that...
Yeah. Well, yeah, he has this theory of enchantment, which it strikes me could equally have been translated after Mulder as entrancement. And it's quite a sophisticated theory. He says, so at one point, they see another barber coming along. It's raining, so the barber's got his basin on his head. And Quixote says, look, it's the King Mambrino's magical helmet. And he grabs it, and the barber says, "What are you doing with my basin?" He says, "This is no basin, it's Mambrino's helmet." And everyone else is saying, "Dong, yeah, it's a bloody basin." And to explain this, he says to Panza, "Is it possible that in all the time you have been with me, you have failed to realize that all things appertaining to us knights errant seem like chimeras, follies, and nonsense because they have been turned on their heads? Not because that is their real state, but because we are always attended by a crew of enchanters who keep transforming everything and changing it into whatever they like. And so what looks to you like a barber's basin looks to me like Mambrino's helmet. And the sage who is on my side showed rare foresight in making everyone take what is really and truly Mambrino's helmet for a barber's basin, because Mambrino's helmet is so highly esteemed that everyone would otherwise have pursued me to try and take it from me." So it's quite a sophisticated theory. It makes me think of that wonderful 1973 art piece by Michael Craig Martin called An Oak Tree, in which the viewer sees a glass of water on a shelf, and this long text, which is part of the work, explains that no, this is really an oak tree. It becomes an oak tree when you look at it and think of it as an oak tree. And what I think what both Michael Craig Martin and Cervantes are addressing here is I mean, they're conducting literary theory, basically. They're thinking about the work of metaphor, which means nothing more than, transposition, seeing one thing in terms of another, a cloud as a sheep, as a flock of cotton wool or whatever. Quixote uses this idea extensively. He uses it to explain everything. Okay, it looks to you like this, but to me, like this is entrancement. Or, that lowly wench we saw was Dulcinea, the noble, but she just looks like a lowly wench because of enchantment. It's his kind of go-to explanation for everything, and I think this stands very close to the question of errancy. I mean, he's a knight errant; he wanders around, but Cervantes gleefully plays with and it works in Spanish as well, the double sense of that word. So, being in error, people say to him, "Errant, sir, knight errant, whose errors I'm paying for." And he talks about his errant thoughts. So there's this double sense of kind of displacement, transposition, wrongness, right? And I think there's this quite intimate relation between a space of errancy and what, after Maurice Blanchot, we might call, a space of literature.
I mean, and that question of metaphor and enchantment, I mean, there is, perhaps this is being a bit too, naive, you might say, that the enchanter, I mean, in a sense, Cervantes is the enchanter, that he has taken, he takes these things and he makes them into whatever he wants, that the author does have this sort of power. Or we might say the author of a chivalric romance can make up all these impossible things for the knight errant to do battle with. But, there is a cloud of dust. Is it two armies fighting? Is it a flock of sheep? Mm. And there's a sense in which it's the author or it's the book or it's the story which makes the decision that they're sheep. But in Don Quixote, he's kind of rebelling against that in some ways. He's saying, I'm not your puppet. Mm-hmm. He's sort of trying to assert somehow his independence from his author, in that you say it's a flock of sheep, but I say it's the army of whoever. And actually, who are you, false enchanter, whoever, to tell me otherwise? And that sort of assertion of his independence from his author.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, they're continually... all of the characters are negotiating and contesting this kind of space. It's not just like, you have a Prospero figure who's controlling the whole island and everyone else is in their, in their power. It reminds me of, to use another very contemporary kind of analogy of the kind of game space of Grand Theft Auto. You traverse this landscape out of which situations and narratives endlessly emerge, and stories cached in other parts of the book kind of pop up, or the characters from them pop out of the very woods and paths. But this is never a smooth space. This space, it can never be traversed kind of smoothly or in anything approaching a kind of authentic manner. So there's this endless kind of buffering and juttering, and every story, every situation has to be critiqued, analysed, debated, often violently contested. I mean, so many of the encounters, like in Grand Theft Auto, turn into fights. And it's very glitchy, right? The narrative is unreliable. It keeps breaking off. I mean, quite early on in the middle of a big battle, the author just goes, I've got to stop here because I don't know what happens next. And then there's a break. And then he says, okay, I've got the continuation of it. The author is Cid Hameti Benengeli. He's a Moor. So I had to have it translated by a Moorish translator. I bumped into in a market. And then in this kind of racist way, he says, well, Moors are all liars anyhow. So I don't know how much of this we can actually, believe in. And then there's this whole fake book subplot, which is actually true. Someone other than Cervantes wrote a pirate second edition, second volume, which Cervantes, delights in trashing, having his characters trash. So again, these kind of endless feedback loops and inconsistencies is a huge amount. I mean, there are inconsistencies in the plot, which they comment on, and so many deliberate mistakes. I mean, Tarquin for Tullius, Perseus for Theseus, Orlando for Farragut, Crete for Thessaly. Almost all the classical allusions are wrong deliberately. And Don Quixote says, well, these errors are down to enchantment. Again.
And then there's the bit when Sancho Panza loses his mule and then he's riding his mule again and then he's lost it again.
And found it if I've lost it? Exactly.
It keeps sort of it appears and, as you say, glitching. It's almost there's the mule and then it flickers and it's gone and then flickers and it's back again. And
yes. But through all of this, what is one of the many extraordinary kind of twists in the novel is that towards the end of the second volume, his Zidane-like fantasy of being the one in that media moment actually comes true. And the actual prose of Cervantes' novel does indeed slip into this rather cliched register of speckled birds and Aurora shuffling off the feathers of her bed. He literally kind of recycles those, but not in quotation marks anymore. So again, the contagion spreads all the way up to the author level and beyond.
Yeah. But in terms of that, the space of it, that one of the things that seems sort of, there are all these coincidences that they, in a sense, he has the whole of the plain of La Mancha to wander around, and yet there's this one road that they keep going up and down. And there's a kind of a choke point, and there's this one inn that they keep stopping there. And he thinks it's a castle that only looks like an inn because it's been enchanted and so on. But so much happens there, and then they meet people, and then someone's brother who they haven't seen for years happens to be at the same inn, and so there's this. I mean, these coincidences of romance, but which sort of seem to be accepted as perfectly normal. No one thinks it's at all surprising that everyone from all corners of the earth sort of ends up in the same pub at the same time.
Absolutely. I mean, it's quite interesting. In the inn, I think he uses the inn, as you say, for many things, Cervantes. But one interesting aspect of what happens there is this collision between the world of labour and industry, productive commerce on the one hand, and this kind of indolence on the other, this shrinking away from productive labour, and which is this is what drives Don Quixote. I mean, he has an estate that he's meant to husband, and he neglects his husbandry. I mean, Cervantes writes, now you must understand that during his idle moments, which accounted for most of the year, this gentleman took to reading books of chivalry with such relish and enthusiasm that he almost forgot about his hunting and even running his property. So Quixote's whole space of enchantment or entrancement emerges, as a kind of turning away, a shrinking away from productivity and from economic productivity as well. So when he's in the inn, the other people in the inn are professionals. They're cloth teasers from Segovia and needle makers from Cordova, doing business. And he's there kind of swooning around. In fact, he gets the innkeeper to knight him, and he says, well, you have to enter this in a book. It has to be recorded. And the only book the innkeeper has is the ledger, the account book for registering muleteers, straw and barley and so on. And the obliging innkeeper says, oh, okay, I'll enter it in here. So again, this is another kind of space of literature, sitting uncomfortably within the account book of productive productivity.
It's almost that Don Quixote's problem is he doesn't have a proper job. And so he decides to go, and he seems to recognise this himself. It's kind of, he doesn't have enough to do, so I'm going to go and be a knight-errant. There's a worthy profession for a gentleman.
But for him, this is labour. I mean, he keeps using this word. I have to labour. I have to toil at this, counterproductive practice of knight-errantry. When he's in the cage that you mentioned a moment ago, he says, "I don't like idling here." And in fact, Sanson Carrasco, one of his sidekicks, comes and tries to rouse him from a stupor when he's laid low by saying, "Look, your inactivity is depriving wrongs of their righting, orphans of their succour, maidens of their honour," etc. So it's a kind of double indolence. His labour is the labour of the imaginary, and he works very hard at this incredibly unproductive or counterproductive, useless labour.
Yeah, although is it useless at the inn? And then after, when they're leaving, and the innkeeper quite reasonably says, "Well, you've got to pay." And he's outraged.
Says, well, that happens in the books. I'm not going to do. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'm a knight-errant. I don't have to pay anything. And then there's yet more violence. I mean, it's something that Carl Miller wrote in the LRB. He was reviewing a reissue of Tobias Smollett's translation of it, and he says that there is too much in the way of grievous bodily harm in Don Quixote.
It's an incredibly violent book. Yeah, for sure.
So almost every encounter, and the beatings and the whippings and the stabbings, and quite early on, Don Quixote has loads of his teeth knocked out, and he sort of becomes this increasingly sort of beaten up.
Absolutely. No, isn't it? I mean, Nabokov says it's a sadistic book, and it's like a laboratory where the people are treated like lab rats and tortured, and he's not wrong.
I mean, also that he's the world, his sort of belatedness, or a man out of time, that he's a landowner, and obviously, well, there's still plenty of landowners now, but there's sort of that coming from a world, essentially, I guess, a feudal agricultural world of landowners and people who worked on the land. But he's moving into a world where there's more commerce, an early capitalist world, essentially. And that's one of his ways of being out of time, is that he's another of your M's, that being machinery, right, or mills, and he doesn't. They're the famous windmills, but there are these other mills, aren't there? Yeah. He, when confronted with this very modern technology, he doesn't recognise it.
Yeah, well, the second mill scene is they're fulling mills. They come to a clearing above the fulling mills in the pitch black, so they can hear the clanking and beating of chains. Fulling mills are these kind of machines for treating wool, and Quixote says these are monsters, and Sancho Panza craps himself again. And I think what they're both reacting to in the different... I mean, in a way, Quixote is right. What he's hearing is the future, the industrialized, technologized, emergent capitalistic world of industry. And the whole of the book, you could really see as a traumatized reaction to the advent of this. I mean, with the famous windmills, he metaphysicalizes technology. I think in that scene already, Blake's dark satanic mills, the whole of Frankenstein, which we'll discuss later, even perhaps the whole of cinema, his whirring mechanisms kind of creating a chimera. I think all of that's anticipated. But the third mill episode is, in a way, the most fascinating. It involves water mills. Quixote gets into a boat with Panza. He thinks some prisoners are in the mill house and he's got to rescue them. Of course, they get caught up in the machinery. They almost drowned. They get pulled out of the river, coughing and spluttering. And Quixote says, as he gets his breath back, he cries, "May God send me a remedy, for everything in this world is trickery, stage machinery, every part of it working against every other part. I have done all I can." So he fails to recognize the actual material machinery of the mills, but he elevates this to the kind of metaphysical machinery of the spectacle, basically.
And we were just about to get onto the spectacle, but the one other aspect of that, sort of the mechanical, is which, as he said, is the problem of guns. And he says at one point, and this is James Kernan's translation again, that "I am tempted to say that it grieves me to the heart to have adopted this profession of knight-errantry in such a detestable age as we now live in." So he knows he's a man out of time. "For although no danger frightens me, still it causes me misgivings to think that powder and lead may deprive me of the chance of winning fame and renown by the strength of my arm and the edge of my sword." So again, that's another way. And I mean, in terms of the sort of modern I mean, that scene again with where he nearly drowns in the boat and the watermills, that Cervantes fought at the Battle of Lepanto and was taken prisoner, lost an arm, and there is a character in the book they meet who had that. And that sort of bringing of essentially geopolitics into the novel as a really sort of forceful reminder that Don Quixote thinks he's riding around in a mythical time and sort of ageless time of knights errant and so on. But actually, this is sort of, in some sense, one of the most crucial events of the 16th century, where the combined forces of Christian or Catholic Europe defeated the Ottoman Empire. This is where the real fighting is, and in a sense, and it brings that, and Cervantes having fought in that. So there's a kind of frustration with this man who doesn't, the way in which the modern world comes crashing in.
Yeah, and a very globalized vision of it. I mean, we get silver mines in Potosi, governors in Mexico. I mean, you get the same in The Merchant of Venice. We're in a very, very recognizably modern world of empire and extractive, brutally violent colonialism and slavery and so on.
And if Sancho Panza really wants to be governor of an island, he shouldn't be following a knight errant. He should be going with a conquistador.
Where he could actually...
Yeah, where he probably could get himself an island.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But Tom, just to go back to your point about the spectacle.
I think Cervantes should be credited way before Guy Debord as the first situationist. He has a very sophisticated understanding of what Debord called, the spectacle, which is power, which is, again, the man behind the curtain and the wizard and so on. And I think, just as we looked at the three mills, I think we could look at three situations in the novel where the spectacle is really prominent. The first would be when Quixote and Panza encounter a theatre group who they first take for devils, but eventually he realizes they're actors. And he says something very interesting. He says, appearances must be examined closely to discover the hidden truth. So there's this sense, we're in a world that needs interpreting. We've got to peel back the curtain and see what's going on behind it. We could see this as a kind of Enlightenment skepticism, curiosity, but also as a kind of proto-Pinchonian or QAnon style, paranoia. And then Quixote, actually, when he understands that this is theatre, he gives basically all the world's a stage speech, the same as Shakespeare's. He says, the same happens in this play of life, in which some act as emperors, others as popes, and in short, all the characters that there can be in a play, but when it is over, in other words, when life ends, death strips them all of the costumes that had distinguished between them, and they are all equals in the grave. The second theatre scene is the puppet show, which is actually being run by this criminal con man called Ginés de Pasamonte, who Quixote freed earlier. He broke out of a cave. He broke out of a cage.
Yeah. And actually a really wonderful moment, right? So they're prisoners. They've been taken prisoner, and Quixote sees them and says, it's my duty to free these men. They have been prisoners, and they say, but they're prisoners. They're criminals. They've been taken prisoner for a reason. And he says, I don't care. They are prisoners, and they must be freed. And I think there's something magnificent about that response of his, actually. It says, it doesn't matter. Here they are in chains. That is wrong. And this question of their criminality and his refusal to sort of enter into that. I mean, it's a kind of exchange, the crime and punishment, and they must pay for their crimes and all of that. And he completely rejects that.
Absolutely. And then this one character loops back to meet him again with a puppet show, and Quixote says, he says, let me show you my puppet show, and Quixote says, fine, I'll watch it. And you get this scene where this boy at the side first kind of narrates, and they critique his narration. It's very meta, but then the puppet show itself starts, and there are all these puppets being Moors, and Don Quixote loses his shit and starts attacking them and beheading these Moors. I've got to decapitate them, and he does. He smashes up all these puppets and ends up having to pay loads of money, and to explain away his actions, he again says, enchanters. The ploy of these enchanters who pursue me is to place before my eyes things as they are, and then change them into what they want them to be. So again, he kind of enters the spectacle. But the third one, which takes up pretty much most of book two, is what I like to think of as the Truman Show that he enters. He comes across this Duke and Duchess who are never named, but they have this big castle, and they take him in as a long-term guest, and they lay on these endless tricks with fire and sounds, and they have ethereal battles staged and chariots bearing the enemies of Amadis of Gaul and so on, and Merlin, and even they get their butler to dress up as the enchanted Dulcinea or the dolorous Duenna, and they set up, they say, look, here's a giant horse, Malambruno's horse, Clavileño has come to take you through the air, and they make it bellow and smoke. It reminds me of that very cruel Channel 4 2005 program called Space Cadets, where a reality show where they put a bunch of not very bright people in a little shaking box and said, you're in space, and filmed them. I mean, it's kind of the same. And they say, you're flying through the air. And Panza absolutely believes it, but Don Quixote is a bit skeptical about this. I mean, the whole question of belief, he starts kind of hedging his bets in terms of what is actually true.
But also, he can ride through the normal, everyday world and see enchantment and dragons and giants and everything everywhere. So in a way, there's somehow, one of the things is that this Duke and Duchess, they've read Volume 1, haven't they? So
yes,
they know who he is. You're the guy from the book that we've read. Oh, great, we can have fun. But they're sort of by creating the appearance, he doesn't need the appearance of these things. He can look at a windmill and say, there's a giant.
Yes.
So the idea you present him with an actual sort of slightly shoddily put together flying machine or whatever, no, it's a dragon. It's kind of, it is wrong, and he can see that there's something wrong because his imagination is enough. Yeah.
Well, there's a big, there's a kind of categorical difference between book 1 and book 2 in that sense, because in book 1, he is self-deluding. In book 2, the delusion has been outsourced, it's exteriorized, and it's other people tricking him. I mean, by the end, they sent him towards the end, they sent him to Barcelona, and the whole city has become like that island in the Truman Show. All the citizens are in on the joke, and they say, it is the great Don Quixote, the knight errant. There's an extraordinary scene where he's taken to see this kind of machine. I mean, literally a machine, an exteriorization of his own delusional apparatus that, I mean, it could be describing our wizard machinery from Oz. Cervantes writes, it was constructed like this. So it's a machine that will, make prognoses and give magical kind of pronouncements and answer questions. Cervantes writes, it was constructed like this. The slab was made of wood, painted and varnished to look like jasper, and the pedestal on which it rested was of the same material, as were 4 eagles' feet projecting from it to support the weight more securely. The bust, resembling the effigy of a Roman emperor, the colour of bronze, was hollow, and it fitted into a hole in the slab so perfectly that the join was invisible. There was also a hollow in the pedestal, exactly under the hollow in the bust, and all this opened into the room underneath. Through this systems of holes in the bust, slab, and pedestal, a tin tube was neatly fitted so that nobody could see it. In the room below, the man who was to reply to all the supplicants' questions was stationed with his mouth to the tin tube, and the voice downstairs went up it, and the voice upstairs came down it, as clearly articulate as through an ear trumpet, and so it was impossible to discover the trick. And when Quixote sees it, his mind flashes back to the puppet show, actually, but at a kind of unconscious level. He doesn't really realize, he doesn't understand that this is a puppet show. I mean, it's interesting in that respect. Hamlet and Quixote are more or less exact contemporaries as characters, but Hamlet, is wise. He puts on the shows. He understands politics as spectacle. He knows that there is a man, literally a man, Polonius, behind the curtain. Don Quixote is inhabiting the exact same theatre of operations, but he's naive.
Yeah. Well, actually, and it's interesting, that question of Hamlet and acting, because one of the many 18th century English novels that's hugely influenced by Don Quixote, being Tom Jones by Henry Fielding. And there's this wonderful scene where they've got to London, and Tom Jones and Partridge, who's his Sancho Panza type character, who's the barber, and he thinks he's his father, but actually he's not. And they go and they see David Garrick's Hamlet. And afterwards, they have talking about the play, and Tom says to Partridge, who did you think was the best actor? I thought, Garrick playing the prince was amazing. And Partridge is like, well, what do you mean? He was a terrible actor. He saw the ghost. He was afraid. I'd be afraid. But the man who played the king, you could tell he was acting. And somehow this idea that the need of the artifice to be visible and that somehow it's natural. It's kind of, well, whatever. He saw a ghost. He was scared. No big deal. But there's a sort of a naive understanding of requiring the naive responses to need to see the acting. Whereas the more sophisticated response that that even the natural seeming is performance.
I mean, I guess in Don Quixote, that Don Quixote is heading from enchantment to wising up, and all the other characters are heading in the other direction. They're like ships passing in the night. And it's that middle space that's so interesting. So when Sancho Panza is saying, no, it was all true, the stuff with the horse and flying through the air, and Quixote's going, nah, I don't know. But Sancho Panza says, well, all that stuff you told us about the Montesino's cave where you had visions of purgatory, that's bullshit. And Quixote says, well, Sancho, since you want people to believe what you saw in the sky, I want you to believe what I saw in the cave of Montesinos. I say no more. At another point, when people are saying to him, look, your Dulcinea, she's just the local wench, Aldonza Lorenzo, please come off it. And he says, look, it is enough for me to be convinced that the good Aldonza Lorenzo is beautiful and virtuous. I imagine that everything I say is precisely as I say it is, and I depict her in my imagination as I wish her to be, both in beauty and in rank, and Helen cannot rival her, nor can Lucretia. So at moments like this, he's in this very sophisticated kind of state of double consciousness. He's both the man behind the curtain and Dorothy. Michael McKeon, the critic, in his 1987 book, The Origins of the English Novel, comments on this. He says these scenes, they constitute an elaborate mechanism for inducing that species of belief without really believing, hyphenated, belief without really believing, which would become, once the mechanism itself proved unnecessary, the realm of the aesthetic.
But there's also, a sense for everyone saying, oh, come off it, mate, you can't really fancy her. And him saying, but I do. And it's not for you to tell me... she is my damsel,
yes,
and no one's going to tell me otherwise. But I know it isn't. He isn't saying that because But it's that there's a bit earlier where he says, "A knight errant who turns mad for a reason deserves neither merit nor thanks. The thing is to do it without cause."
Yes. Well, there is a point where he actually, very Hamlet-like, he says, I've got to go mad at this point because I'm being rejected in love. So how do I go mad? Oh, I better bang my head against this rock. And Panza says, look, can't you just pretend to bang your head? He says, no, I've got to actually do it. So again, like Hamlet, kind of, being mad. I mean, he has a sophisticated kind of double consciousness understanding of doing and not doing, but actually doing, even though it's a performance, but it's real. Or like this narrator who, even as he falls in love with Albertine, understands the mechanism, all the Racine and everything else that's kind of fueling and filtering and kind of generating this desire. He's not naive in that sense. He understands that it's through these cultural kind of filters that that his experience is being generated, but he believes it anyhow.
And which is, of course, true to life.
Yes,
of course. Hollywood has a huge influence on the way people expect human relationships to form and to take place. And that, in a sense, we're all Don Quixote. You watch enough romantic comedies, you think that's how your life should go, as it were.
Right.
Those things and all. So it's not only a literary thing. It's an acknowledging the extent to which everyone, there are stories that are told about the way things go, and also everyone expecting to be the hero of their own story that you see and watch in action films, and you kind of think, well, that's how everything's done. There's the hero, and he does the stuff, and it's in a way we're all
right. Well, yes and no. I would argue that of course, that is the kind of operational logic, but that's overlaid with the rhetoric of authenticity. Be true to yourself, become what you truly are. No filter, man. Whereas, even the more and more we are filtered and mediated, the more this kind of ideology of non-mediated, pure, authentic being is kind of icing dusted on top of it. Whereas Quixote is precisely navigating the contradictions of that situation and dredging up all the feedback loops and mechanisms and narrative codes and making them visible. I mean, it's extremely subversive. And the effect on him is, like I said a moment ago, it's this progressive disenchantment. He ends up wise and everyone else ends up infected. So by the end, he's saying, look, this was all nonsense. I'm not Don Quixote. I'm just, Alonso Quixada. And all his entourage are going, no, what? Stop. Get off stop being lazy. Get off your bed and get back to, we're going to go out and be, at this point, he's decided they should all be poets. I'm already starting to compose all these sestinas and things. We're going to go around and be shepherd poets reenacting Arcadia, and so it's completely switched.
But in a sense, though, they are right, because once that moment that he recognizes, he has is a way that the total disenchantment. He says, "I'm not Don Quixote," all the rest of it, and then he dies because actually. He is Don Quixote. That in terms of the character in the novel, that's who he is. That the novel begins not with the childhood and the reading of the books. It kind of it begins. He is Don Quixote, and the Alonso Quixana and all the names which he. At the beginning, we're told we don't even know what his name is. And then at the end, it picks on one of them.
Yeah,
but
true.
and then he dies, and that's the end of it. And then you have all the stuff about, this is the end of the story, and anyone who writes any other stories, they're all fake.
They're using an ostrich feather for a quill because they're so bad.
Yeah. And there's this kind of, and there is the moment that somehow actually you strip away all the illusions and the trance and the enchantment and everything. And there is nothing there, and he's dead. That you actually, the reality needs the enchantment, it needs the trance, it needs the belief that he otherwise, he's no one.
Absolutely, there's nothing there. I mean, I think another thing this book anticipates. We've talked about media theory, but I think it very much anticipates 20th century psychoanalysis, and for Freud through Lacan, the pathology is pleasure. It's a form of pleasure. It's a form of meaning creation. The problem with pathology is not that it makes people miserable, it's that it makes their life dysfunctional because they run around attacking windmills and things. So, I mean, Lacan's very explicit on this. When you cure someone, you're not making them happier, you're making them more functional in a day-to-day, in a real world, by removing their disruptive pleasure. And this is exactly what, Cervantes uses the word pleasure endlessly. It keeps coming up. His pleasure, his desire, it gave him such pleasure he got so much pleasure. And at the end, he's miserable because his pleasure has been removed.
Another way in which he's sort of out of time is that he's a 50-year-old man behaving like a small child.
Yeah.
Play and pretend, live in worlds of make-believe, and that's all great, and adults aren't allowed to do that.
Yes.
And one of the things that Don Quixote is doing is he's playing at, well, not cops and robbers, he's playing at knights and damsels, and there's a childishness that he hasn't left behind, and it's this, and also the people who are joining in and making sport of him and bullying him are actually also reverting to a kind of
it's a pleasurable, yeah. I think again, if we think of Lacan, when he writes about the mirror phase, he says this is a formative moment, but it continues into adulthood. So Lacan's idea of the mirror phase is when the child sees themselves in the mirror, they, at that moment, and recognizes themselves, they form an ideal I, an ideal conception of themselves, a heroic kind of perfect version of themselves, which they can never coincide with. But for the rest of their life, that will kind of accompany them. He uses the image of a tangent that can only join its line asymptotically, i.e. at infinity, i.e. never. So, and I think Don Quixote is a perfect example of this. The approach to the ideal version of oneself, which can never actually be reached, and the real the disaster that befalls him is not that. It's realizing that he can never reach it, and he says, it's very sad. He says at the end, My mind has been restored to me, and it is now clear and free, without those gloomy shadows of ignorance cast over me by my wretched, obsessive reading of those detestable books of chivalry. Now I can recognise their absurdity and their deceitfulness, and my only regret is that this discovery has come so late that it leaves me no time to make amends by reading other books. That might be a light for my soul. He gets the last little joke in. I'll cure my book delirium by reading books.
Yeah, I mean, it's different. I mean, or maybe it's not that different. I mean, just thinking of that, Dr. Faustus, I'll burn my books. And Prospero drowning his books.
Yes,
and that.
Yes, it's the end. Well, so much of Don Quixote is about the problem of the book. We mentioned earlier the innkeeper not knowing where in the book to recount, to enter the event of his knighting, and he puts it in the ledger, the business ledger, this kind of weird book. And Quixote is thinking, the end point, in this very Mallarmean way, he says, the end point of all this is a book, which will be about me. But there's a wonderful, actually, Altisidora, who we mentioned earlier, who kind of deludes him, but then herself kind of slips into this kind of role play. She describes this vision she had of purgatory, where all these devils are playing pelota with books. It's like kind of William Burroughs' film called Towers Open Fire, in which you see these books exploding and papers flying everywhere. And one of the books, of course, is Don Quixote. So the whole thing, the whole issue is kind of the problem of the book. And another brilliant 20th century writer on Don Quixote, from a quite psychoanalytical perspective as well, is René Girard, in his book from 1961, Deceit, Desire and the Novel. And he says Quixote is a perfect example of what he calls mimetic desire, right? So the chivalric model is the mediator of desire. So Amadis of Gaul kind of mediates Don Quixote's desire for chivalric authenticity at the same time as Don Quixote mediates Sancho Panza's desire for an island. It's always in triangles, right? And he uses this to kind of Girard to draw a distinction between what he calls romance and what he calls the novel, or the novelistic. He says the difference between romance and the novel is that the novel reveals the mechanism of mimetic desire. It's born of a move beyond romance. He says it's run through, the novelistic is won through a great struggle against these attitudes we have lumped together under the name romantic, because they all appear to us intended to maintain the illusion of spontaneous desire and of a subjectivity almost divine in its autonomy, right? So the novel is that which is born through this arduous passage beyond and against romance, but this is also a move beyond desire, right? So Girard says Cervantes could not have written Don Quixote if the same object had not been for him first an enchanted helmet and then an ordinary barber's basin. The novelist is a man who has overcome desire and who, remembering it, can make a comparison. The novelist is a hero cured of metaphysical desire. The novelist is a metamorphosed hero.
So I suppose in that sense, one of the other ways in which Don Quixote is metafictional is that Don Quixote is not only the first, Don Quixote in italics is not only the first modern novel, and he's not only the first hero, in inverted commas, of a novel, but there's a sense in which he is the first novelist, that the process that Don Quixote goes through in this double seeing of the world and the way in which the kind of synthesis he reaches at the end of that, he is a novelist. So there's a sense in which it's a model for novelists, not only in the way the book's written, but here is what Don Quixote does, and his double way of seeing the world is how novelists have to see the world.
I think that's absolutely right. Yes, and it sets the template for everything through, Joyce's Ulysses, Ingeborg Bachmann's Malina, all the novels of Thomas Bernhard, where the central kind of stake and undertaking within the novel is the production of the novel itself. Proust, obviously, as well. And so, what emerges through the course of the novel is the very it takes us to the threshold of the possibility of the novel happening, a kind of discovery of the mechanisms and systems that will produce, this field of the novel. So, I mean, in that sense, I'm kind of tempted to end our discussion by going right back to the beginning and looking at the prologue.
Which again is a scene, it's showing you the production of writing. This is how you write one of these.
Yeah, it's showing you the man behind the curtains little
right at the
den
beginning.
Right at the very beginning. So Cervantes shows himself sitting at his writing station, picking up and setting down his pen with the paper in front of me, the pen behind my ear, my elbow on the desk and my cheek in my hand. It's wonderful. And then he goes into this long disavowal of anything natural. He says, Although I may seem like Don Quixote's father, I am his stepfather. He uses all these tropes of unnatural genesis, of kind of bastarding or bend sinistering of the whole sign under which the writing takes place. And then he drops in loads of tips about, how you can appear learned by dropping learned allusions, even if they're wrong, because he says they're not going to bloody check them anyhow, so who cares? But
everything we've said today has been fully referenced and absolutely
Oh, he knows
accurate,
everything. He's scripted this conversation, 500 years ago. Don't worry about that. But there's a very interesting allusion as well he makes to Zeuxis, who, in Pliny's account, is famously tricked by Parrhasius in their painting competition. Zeuxis paints fruit so realistic that the birds come down from the sky and try and eat his painting. And then he looks at Parrhasius's painting of a curtain and says, well, pull back the curtain so I can see what the painting is. And Parrhasius basically goes, psych, dude, it's a painting of a curtain. So I think that's right at the beginning. He's giving us that. But even before, the very first two words of Don Quixote are idle reader, desocupado lector, which I think is wonderful. Right at the beginning, he's showing us that the ultimate, final, and the first and final space of unproductive productiveness is you, the reader.
Tom McCarthy, thank you very much.
A pleasure.
Next time, we'll be talking about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
See you soon.